In this episode, I talk to Professor Dr. Rainer Storb, medical doctor, physician and professor, pioneer of the blood stem cell transplantation, and one of the most impactful biomedical scientists and research translators of our time. Rainer is one of the trailblazers who established bone marrow and stem cell transplantation as an effective treatment for diseases like leukemia, lymphoma, and aplastic anemia. As a physician, he has been treating patients with the therapies he himself has discovered, designed, studied, and standardized. After completing his medical doctorate in Freiburg in 1960, performing clinical work in Essen and Munich, and conducting medical research on a NATO Science Fellowship in Paris, he started his work on stem cell transplantation in 1965 on a Fulbright grant in Seattle, Washington. We talk about the seemingly hopeless case he and his colleagues took on when he first entered the field in the 1960s.
I mean, everybody who had done and tried transplant had left the field because nothing had worked. There were about 200 published cases and they all died, all the patients, for various reasons.
The adversarial circumstances under which they were conducting their research, the challenges they faced, sometimes practical, sometimes scientific.
You had to demonstrate, for example, for autologous transplantation that you could store human bone marrow.
How he dealt with these challenges, and how first transplantations in humans started to work consistently. He was also a key figure in maturing the method and translating it to standard procedures for cancer clinics worldwide. We find out how stem cell transplantation evolved into a procedure that has been performed more than 1 million times around the globe since Rainer and his colleagues laid the groundbreaking foundations. Over the 50 years to follow, he continued to innovate in the field, establishing various methods to increase the transplantation effectiveness and decrease its adversarial side effects on patients. For example, we learn about how he discovered the graft versus leukemia effect. And we talk about how Rainer envisions a cancer treatment free of aggressive radiation and heavy chemotherapy on the path to eliminating cancer. I'm certain you'll be fascinated by the story of Professor Dr. Rainer Storb, interviewed by Mohammed Khan. I know you've grown up in Essen, which is exactly the city that I'm in. You're now in Seattle, so you're a couple of 1,000 kilometers away. But how do you remember your hometown, and how did you grow up here? So tell me a bit about your childhood.
Well, I was born in 1935 in pre-war Essen, and in a suburb called Essen-Borbeck. And my father was a practicing physician. And then I started going to school, but then the war already had started and bombing took place. And the school that I went to, as well as other schools, were destroyed. And so the city farmed all the kids out to camps in the countryside. My parents put me in a small boarding school in Oberstdorf, which is the southernmost town in Germany, actually. And so I grew up in this, during the war, in this little boarding school with, I think, 48 children. And it was outside of the village or the town, and at about close to 1,000 meter altitude. And that's where we spent the war years. Beautiful area. In the winter, could go skiing, the summer mountain climbing, but we were all really homesick. That was a predominant feeling that we had. And it wasn't until September, I believe, of 1945 that one set of parents picked up their two sons, also from Essen, and they were not particularly well liked by the Nazis. So their business, export-import, was closed, and they sort of lived on savings, but they had saved an old BMW convertible, a large car. So they came down with my mother and picked us three kids up, and it took us 1 week to get home because the bridges over many rivers were destroyed, and we had to wait for little ferry boats and came back home to a destroyed city. And we didn't have school until about 1 year later. because the schools were still not up and running. And then one of the schools in Essen-Borbeck, even though it was without windows, because they were all destroyed, then started seeing us again. So from 46 on until 55, April 55, I was in Essen, went to Gymnasium Borbeck and graduated there in April of 55, and decided to go to medical school. I was torn between engineering and medical school, and went as far away as I could from home, because I didn't want to come home every weekend, to München. And was there until 1958, when I decided that München was very distracting. All these girls, the parties, and all this stuff, and went to Freiburg Medical School in 58, where I graduated just after my 25th birthday from medical school in 1960. And then I went back to Essen, did my internship in surgery, then to München, I did my internship in internal medicine, then back to Essen, gynecology obstetrics. And at that point, I decided I wanted to do research, and I got a NATO science fellowship, with which I went to Paris and worked in a basic science laboratory with a man named Marcel Bessis. And it was very exciting, actually. We had always American visitors coming through. I worked with a couple of Americans in the lab. One was from the Mayo Clinic, the other one from Memphis. We published in the journal Science, Journal of Cell Biology, Experimental Cell Research. But then I felt I was getting too far away from what I really liked, is clinical medicine. I wanted to do something translational, and spoke to one of the visitors who came through the lab, and he recommended 3 names. One was at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, George Brecker. The other one, Fred Storb, was in Boston, and then he mentioned Don Thomas, who had just moved to the relatively new medical school in Seattle, the University of Washington. And I went to the library, looked at all the CVs, I wrote them all letters. They all said, oh yeah, you have space in the lab. And so I then decided on Don Thomas, who did something that had perhaps the potential to get into the clinic. And that's where I got the Fulbright scholarship. I had no idea in retrospect how I got to that, but I got. And so in August of.
Let me ask one question here. So at the time, what were you working on in Paris with?
Myself, as we worked on,
yeah,
we had developed a technique of irradiating cells with laser beams, which ordinarily doesn't do anything to the cell. But then we had developed vital staining, and we were interested in mitochondria and used a stain called Janus green. If you did this with really minimal concentrations, you could knock out the mitochondria. We had developed a technique which was fairly elegant, actually, of finding the cells that you irradiated and do electron microscopy. First of all, we did filming, and then we did phase contrast photography, and then electron microscopy. So it was a very elegant technique that enabled us to exactly pinpoint the cell that we irradiated. And so we worked on that and did long-term cultures, looked at chromosomal changes. So it was actually a really neat technology, but I felt I didn't see any way of applying this. So I traveled also in my vacations through Germany, and I visited, I think, 14 different universities and institutes, Max Planck, pathology, internal medicine. And I came back always very disappointed with the options that existed in Germany. At the medical schools, Department of Medicine, for instance, it was mainly clinical work, and the laboratory you did in the evening hours. I didn't feel that was satisfactory. Pathology, well, you did some service pathology. And then the Max Planck, there was no way of applying anything. So
you really,
that's how I,
so you really wanted to work at this interface of both conducting research and also bringing it into application, bringing it to patients, bringing it to actually healing the disease, not only creating the research itself, or creating disease, healing diseases, not only creating the research itself. And that is what you were lacking, you're saying.
that's what I was lacking in Germany. And the same was true in France, actually. And so I got this Fulbright scholarship, and then I finished my work in Paris in August of 65. And we had enough work done, actually, for 4 additional papers, which I took with me to Seattle. And then one of my colleagues was in France. One was at the Mayo Clinic, the other one in Memphis. And you can imagine how difficult it was to write these papers with airmail, right? And carbon copies, unimaginable today. Where you click, and I just submitted a paper yesterday to a European journal with a click of a button. And the Fulbright, the requirement was that we traveled by ship, by ocean liner from Bremerhaven to New York. So there were, on this ship, there were 700 Fulbright scholars, Americans who returned from Germany and Germans who went to America. And then there were maybe 800 other passengers. It was an old ship from the 1920s. The Berlin from the Bremer Lloyd. And it took us 10 days to cross the ocean. It was endless and boring. It felt like enclosed. And anyway, in New York, we were then allowed to take an airplane. And I got there via Canton, Ohio, where I visited relatives.
Did you ever meet one of the fellow Fulbrighters you met on the ship? Did you ever see some of them again?
We never met again, no.
Oh, wow.
The only other who went to the West Coast went to Portland, and then he returned back to the shaling company in Berlin. He had a job with shaling. So he was, I believe, a chemist or something like this. But I never met any one of them again.
I assume nowadays you would exchange probably phone numbers. I guess that wasn't an option back then, right? I think nowadays you would do a WhatsApp group or something, or exchange phone numbers, and you would keep connected. That was a different.
But I mean, I think you have all the electronic communication systems, which exist at the telephone, which was unbelievably expensive, and then the letter. That was it. And so I was disappointed coming here because John Thomas's lab wasn't even at the medical school. It was in a teaching hospital about 6 miles or 10 kilometers away, called the United States Public Health Service Hospital. It was a federal hospital. There were 9 of those in the US at the time. And it was up on the 10th floor in old patient rooms. And there was only Don Thomas. There was an instructor in medicine, so that's the lowest rung, Bob Epstein. And then there was the lab technician, the secretary, and 2 animal technicians. And we had a few animals on the 10th floor up there, a few dogs. But the remainder were about 6 miles away in an abandoned World War II bunker, a naval communications bunker in West Seattle. So we had to drive 10 kilometers, and then you descended, I think, 3 sets of stairs to this underground facility, which also housed our total body irradiation.
Right. I mean, like for our listeners, because I'm not sure our listeners, all of them will know Professor Dr. Edward Donald Thomas. He would later go on to receive in the 1990s, would be receiving a Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine. So that was going to become very groundbreaking research. What is going to happen in this place and in this kind of unspectacular setting that you are describing. At the time, can you describe to me, I mean, like we know that you will be working on bone marrow transplantation. Can you describe to me what the general opinion of bone marrow transplantation was at the time? And what your opinion on this was at the time before you started working on it yourself? You just said that you were working on radiation in Paris, so you weren't working on bone marrow transplantation yourself at the time, only when joining Professor Thomas in Washington. So what was your opinion of bone marrow transplantation, and what was the public opinion of bone marrow transplantation?
It sounded like an intriguing concept, right? But it was at the time considered to be a total failure. I mean, everybody who had done and tried transplant had left the field because nothing had worked. There were about 200 published cases and they all died, all the patients, of various reasons. And there were probably many, many more unpublished cases. So the field was considered dead. Our University of Washington colleagues considered us idiots. I mean, really, we were outcasts. And we weren't even at the medical school. For lectures, we had to drive 10 kilometers to a town to get to lectures at the U. Or if you wanted to go to the library, it was, again, 10 kilometers driving. So, and the work was really, really primitive. Since we didn't have many technicians, Bob Epstein and I did everything ourselves. We did the morning treatments of the dogs, blood samplings, injections of drugs. We went back to the lab. We had to do our own blood counts. On weekends, you were on your own. There was no technician there to help you. So you did the treatments, you did the blood counts yourself. You had to learn how to do white blood cell counts, hematocrits, platelet counts, and record everything. And then you had to do transfusions. So it was beyond description primitive. The West Seattle labs were very primitive. They were, the bunker was rather large and most of it was unused. And there were all these old Brownian tubes, all the radio equipment was still lying around there, abandoned basically. And so you can't imagine how primitive it was. And Bob and I sat down and decided to look as to what went wrong with the preceding efforts. And so we made a list of things. Up on top was the tissue typing, which was a total black box, which was begun by a late friend of mine, actually, Jean Doucet in Paris, who also got the Nobel Prize for that work years ago. He died in the meantime, but nobody knew how to do the typing. It was very primitive.
I think
so that was one other condition.
Go ahead. I think before we go into the depths of the typing, our listeners would appreciate, and me, to be honest, too, would appreciate if you guide us a bit. If you guide us a bit through how does the blood production work in a healthy human? What is the disorders that the blood production system can develop, and why were the therapies as of then not sufficient?
Well, the target diseases are non-malignant diseases such as immune deficiency disorders, such as aplastic anemia, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, the hemoglobinopathies, autoimmune diseases. And then on the malignant side, you have leukemias, the various leukemias, lymphomas, myelomas, myelodysplastic syndromes, the big indication. And so there are a fair number of target diseases. And what went wrong was the grafts were not matched. And so they were rejected in the early experience, or if they did by chance engraft, caused graft versus host disease, which was fatal, or the patients relapsed with their underlying disease, and patients died of infections. But the predominant cause was rejection of the graft, and then the patient died from basically bone marrow aplasia and infections. And so the question was how to get this all straight. So we worked on conditioning treatments so that the grafts didn't get rejected. Then we worked on prevention of graft versus host disease, which was the big thing. Nobody knew how to do this. We worked on the tissue typing and had to develop our own tissue typing technology guided by what was being done in humans, of course. We worked on infection prevention, transfusion support, and all those things. I mean, early on, for instance, when we started human transplantation, the blood bank here didn't provide platelet transfusions because they didn't believe it would work. And so we had to show ourselves in animals that it works. And then for the first, I would say, 6 years, we provided our own platelet transfusion support. We hired a physician who was from India, whose husband was working with Boeing, and she became our platelet lady. And we bought her a couple of centrifuges, and then she called us up, like, Reiner, I need some platelets tomorrow afternoon. Are you around? And so we all donated platelets until the blood bank finally accepted that this is a good thing, and they took that over. But you can see how primitive the early years were.
Why was it so primitive? So my first question would be in this space. So why was it so primitive? Was it because of the lack of money, because people didn't really believe in it? Or was it simply because the medical field wasn't as advanced yet and it simply didn't exist a more elaborate kind of procedure for this kind of research?
Well, the medical field wasn't ready for this. As I said, they didn't believe it. They called us our own colleagues in our own department and in our own division. They called us idiots or cowboys or something like this, because they just didn't believe that this would ever come to anything. You had to demonstrate, for example, for autologous transplantation that you could store human bone marrow. And we did show this in monkeys, that you can store it for a year and it still works. And so that set the stage for human application. So all of these single steps had to be introduced from the animal experience. And as I said, initially there was this incredible disbelief that this would ever actually amount to anything. So we began.
Did you share Did you share this disbelief, or did you believe that this would lead to what it would actually lead to? So did you foresee the potential success, or how did you sustain your optimism, is what I'm wondering.
We then actually wrote letters to veterinarians along the West Coast, asking that they refer dogs with lymphoma, which is a fatal disease in dogs. And they did this, actually. We had about 1,500 referrals over the years from as far away as Louisiana, actually. They were flown in, and we experimented in these dogs with autologous transplantations and with allogeneic from a donor. And when we showed that this worked, Dr. Thomas got a small sum of money, $75,000 in 1969, and there was an abandoned obstetrics ward in the public health hospital on the 7th floor, one whole wing that was empty. And we converted that into a small transplant unit with, I believe, 6 beds. Don hired nurses and a ward clerk And, we established 6 rooms, and then we began attending as physicians. So each of us spent at least 3 months attending on that little transplant ward, and we irradiated the patient in that bunker in West Seattle. They had to be carried down the staircase, very primitive. And then they came back, and then we began transplantation with very primitive typing techniques. And for example, when we started out, there was only one HLA antigen known, HLA-A. I still have a paper where we describe this. And today we match for 14 alleles, right, with improved technology. But then it was serological. We did the typing ourselves. There was no laboratory doing that in the whole of Seattle, actually, or in the whole of, there was the next one down was in Los Angeles, Paul Terasaki. So you can see how primitive all of this was. And we did our own typing. So we sat there when the cells were ready, looked through the inverted, the phase contrast microscope, and began counting blue cells and white cells, because we used turbo blue exclusion as a criterion for matching. So you cannot believe. And then we did our own bone marrow aspirations in the surgical suite, which was on the 9th floor. And then we screened and so on. And we did our own cryopreservation for autologous transplantation. That thing was in the hallway. It was a very primitive freezer, and so on and so forth. We infused the bone marrow ourselves. We infused transfusions ourselves because we only had very few doses. And when you were attending, you were also on night call. So you were called in. It was pioneering work, because there wasn't the kind of support mechanisms that we had today. And in 1972, in addition to Mira Banaji, the platelet lady, we hired an infectious disease physician. And that's now a large group of infectious disease. They have their own building here on campus, actually, out of this one-man operation, and so on. So
did you continuously yourself? Did you believe you could make it? So it sounds like you had to fight under adversarial circumstances all the time. So you didn't have the correct equipment. Everybody was kind of telling you that this will never work out. You were under these really harsh circumstances for research. Were you yourself convinced you would do it, or did you have a lot of doubt yourself too?
Well, we had the direct personal experience with dogs, the lymphoma dogs. These dogs then were sent home back to their owners, and all the owners they weren't charged anything. The owners all needed to do is give us an update periodically. Then I worked in monkeys, for example, the conditioning treatment that we still use today in aplastic anemia. I worked out in monkeys and published, I believe, in 1970. So you have the feeling, if this works in these experimental animals, and you did this with your own hands, there was nobody else helping you. You were the technician and the researcher at the same time. Then you are actually fairly convinced that this will work in humans. And so I was the only one who did the lab work and continued doing the lab work. My other colleagues at the time, Don, Dean Buckner, and so on, they were mainly clinicians, but I was the translator, and I remained the translator until just now. And so if you do the experiment in animals, and you really make absolutely sure that you did all the things that are necessary to rule out that this is a fluke result, something like this, then you have the firm conviction that this should also work in humans. It did. We still have patients alive from, I think my longest one is from 1971. And he's a a retired school principal living in San Diego. So we contacted him not long ago to get some blood samples for some interesting molecular studies that we're doing currently.
Wow. So, so he was one of the patients who survived. I assume that throughout your experiments, there must have also been patients which did not survive and which passed away as part of your studies. They were maybe in a condition, in one of those study conditions where you would not treat them, or you would treat them with established mechanisms, or you would treat them even with your own new way of treating them, and they would die. How would you? So number one, did you speak to all the patients beforehand yourself, or was this somebody else who spoke to the patients, telling them they were involved in this part of research? And number two, how did you maintain optimism in the face of loss of patients?
Well, it is true that early on we lost a lot of patients. The main reasons were two. In patients with leukemia, it was relapse. That was the biggest issue. But the second biggest issue early on was cytomegalovirus pneumonia. It's something that we did not encounter in dogs because they don't get the virus. So that was a big surprise. Our very first patients died of that, actually. And so it took years to fix that problem. It wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that molecular monitoring enabled us to pick up reactivation really early. And secondly, a drug, ganciclovir, was introduced, which prevents the development of disease. Similarly, we had problems with chickenpox reactivation, which happened in about 40% of patients at a cumulative incidence curve in the first year. And early on, that could be fatal. And again, the introduction of acyclovir in the 80s got rid of that problem. So there were a lot of issues. And yes, when you were attending, you were faced with communicating with the family and the patient about how to proceed. And in the end, you had to simply say, well, there isn't really any hope here. And we probably ought to, prepare the patient for death. And so that was all in your hands as the attending physician. And yeah, the early years were, how did we maintain optimism? Well, we recognized the problem. And so people began working on improving on the problem. Like graft-versus-host disease, we continue to work on it. Our first drug was called methotrexate, an antifolate. And then by trial and error, we found out that when you combine methotrexate, a short course, with a calcineurin inhibitor such as cyclosporin or tacrolimus, you had far superior graft-versus-host disease prevention, and so on. So you kept moving ahead by going into the laboratory again, and then going out of the laboratory, going into clinic, first doing a phase 1/2 study, showing that it's tolerated, and then you do a phase 3 trial. And in this case, we did 2 of them. One comparing the drug, the combination to methotrexate alone, the other one to cyclosporin alone, and that still is today one of the mainstays. But then new drugs came about. We evaluated those, and it goes on and on like this. So you kept going back and forth from the clinic. You encountered the problem, and then you said, well, there must be a solution for it. Go back to the laboratory, and then find something and move into the clinic again. And that's what motivated me. But you have to go and see the patients by being attending physician for a month in a row, by being on call. And at going through this with the families.
Wow.
So,
when did you first understand yourself that you were onto something, that you were actually succeeding in something that everybody else told you cannot succeed? What was at this moment of illumination?
it took a little while for the patients with leukemia, but in aplastic anemia, which was a particular interest of mine because you don't have this relapse problem. There, we translated the methotrexate regimen for graft versus host prevention and this cyclophosphamide regimen that we first evaluated in dogs and then in primates. We did exactly what we did in these animals and started in 1970 with a single patient who unfortunately died of cytomegalovirus infection. But then the next patients in 71 were all successful. And that gave us a lot of optimism. Now, two of these died. One of them had hepatitis-associated aplastic anemia, but we didn't know which type at the time because only A and B were known, and he was A and B negative. Then he was hepatitis C later on. And then he developed, sadly, chronic active hepatitis, and we recommended a liver transplant to him, but he declined. And then 35 years later, he developed hepatic carcinoma, and that's what he died of. But so the other ones lived longer. And I forget what one of them died of, but one of them is still alive. And so that gave us a lot of optimism. All of a sudden, you had 45% success. What was the reason for failure? Well, mostly rejection. So we worked on that and figured out a technique to make blood products less immunogenic by removing leukocytes and by irradiating. Totally serendipitous finding. And it took us a few years to convince the blood bank to take this up as a routine procedure. Now it's routine worldwide, but it takes the medical community always very long time. So the sensitization issue was minimized, and then we developed also a conditioning regimen that's also being used. We made our own anti-thymocyte globulin, and since you were in Redmond, it's a farm that used to be where the Microsoft campus is. There was an old farmer who kept horses, goats, and rabbits for us. And I got thymuses from the pediatric cardiac surgeons who fixed congenital defects, which they removed the thymus of these patients and tossed it out, and they gave it to me. No consent forms. We took it, we made a suspension out of it, injected it with post adjuvant into the horses, into the goats, and to the rabbits. And a nice anecdote, the first horse I injected with the animal technician who lived in Bellevue across the lake. And then Don Thomas, the next morning, heard that we did this. He said, Rainer, I can do this booster injection because I live over there in Bellevue as well. And that saves you a trip over. And I said, okay. So 2 weeks later, I gave him this big syringe with the suspension. Don Thomas and Ted Graham, the animal technician, went over there. The horse saw the syringe and ran. And Don said, I'm from Texas, just give me a lasso and we'll catch the horse. It took him an hour and a half to catch the horse and then give him a booster injection. And that was the last time Don ever volunteered to do this again. But the horse made good antibody, but also made anti-hemagglutinating antibodies, which I could not remove by absorption and so on. So we abandoned the horse and eventually settled on the rabbits. But we made our own anti-thymocyte globulin for about 10 years until I convinced the drug company to pick up on. Anyways.
So most of what you're describing is end of 60s, beginning of 70s. I've read through a study from, I think you together with Professor Thomas and your colleagues published to the New England Journal of Medicine. So you have published, of course, I think you have published over 1,000 papers to which you are author or co-author. You have around 100,000 citations. This specific paper that I was referring to was published in 1975 in the medical press section.
Papers,
Indeed. This one was published in 75 in the medical progress section under the name bone marrow transplantation. I think it's always a great sign if you can get away with such a paper title, because this knows that you're the pioneer of a field. If your paper title is as plain as bone marrow transplantation. Okay. So then what I'm wondering is, how do you go from these research and scientific discoveries to a standard medical procedure that is applied in the oncological units all over the globe? How do you actually go from a research discovery to a standard procedure which is applied globally?
Early on, there was only George Santos's group at Johns Hopkins and our group here doing these transplants. Then George was looked at by his colleagues in the same way as an idiot. And so all of a sudden, when we presented at national, international meetings, people began sending young doctors to us, some of them into the laboratory for a couple of years minimum. Others came only for clinical experience. And so they stayed for 6 months to 2 years on our service. They came from all over the world, from Europe. My first European postdoc was from München, Hans-Jochen Kolb, who's retired now. And then my second European one was sent by Jean Doucet, Eliane Gluckman from Paris. And so I had about, I think, 160 postdocs in my laboratory, but then there were hundreds of visiting physicians who, when they came, were actually on the service the next day and served as physicians. We had incredible nurses who had been with us sometimes for decades, who kept an eye on these individuals. We had very good attending. So these people then went back to Japan or back to Germany, because in Germany there was no transplant center in the early years. We had a lot of German patients coming over, and even the ROK paid for this here in Seattle. And so it was these people who were then ambassadors. And the same was true for George Santos. So all of a sudden you had young, energetic individuals all over the world who began transplanting. And that's, I think, how the field actually advanced, because the more transplant centers you have, the more progress is made locally, small steps, all of this. And so now it's being done worldwide. I think except for Africa, maybe South Africa has something, and maybe Egypt, but every other continent has a fairly large transplantation presence.
You became also a founding member of the Fred Hutch Cancer Center. So what we were discussing as of now, so far until now, was while you were working with Professor Thomas, then you were becoming a professor, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor at UW, University of Washington in Seattle. In 1975, you founded the Fred Hutchinson, the Hutch Cancer Research Center. So what was the reasoning of founding your own institute?
Yeah, it was complicated. We were at the Public Health Source, we were doing really well. When in late 1970, the Nixon administration decided to get out of the hospital business and close all 9 public health service hospitals. There were protests against this, but we saw the handwriting on the wall, and Don looked around for where could we move. The medical school was not interested. They said, you're such a big group, you would set a precedent. So we looked at Children's Hospital. We looked at the Veterans Administration Hospital, which is also a part of the teaching hospital group here. We looked at Portland, and nothing really came out of it. And then one day he came back and he said, I met this guy. He's a surgeon at Swedish Hospital. It's one of the big private hospitals. Bill Hutchinson, he says that he's a bit of a bigot. He's very conservative. But he has this idea of a regional cancer center, and he has $3.5 million in a bank account, donations from the Baseball Association and the Teamsters Union. And he has the idea of naming this after his brother, Fred Hutchinson, who died of lung cancer. He was a baseball star and baseball coach. And so Don said, well, it looks like that might be the only viable option. And so they interested 3 other groups at the university in joining. One was the Hellstrom Laboratory, tumor immunology, the Hakamori Laboratory, which membrane biochemistry, and Donovan Thompson, an epidemiologist. So they were, and we were the biggest group. And so a grant application was written to the federal government to obtain matching funding, which was 3/4 matching funds. And it was turned down. And then an important senator from this state named Warren Magnuson, who was the head of the Appropriations Committee of the Senate, stepped in. His wife had been a patient of the surgeon, Bill Hutchinson, that's Swedish. And Magnuson turned the decision around. And all of a sudden, in April of 72, I had just come back from UCLA, where I looked at a job, and went into Don's office and said, Don, I'm not really interested in UCLA. It's another one of those, largely administrative jobs. And he said, oh, good, we just got word the grant will be funded. And so in 72, the Hutch was founded on paper. We met with, and then the question was, where do we build? And again, the medical school was not interested. Really strange. And so even though we were the division of oncology of the University of Washington, and Swedish Hospital said, if you build here, we'll give you a city block for $1. It was an empty parking lot. And so Don went, and the medical director of Swedish, Ellen Law, by handshake, sold the city block to the Hutch for $1. And then an architect firm, Nermo, Bain and Brady, was engaged, and the Hutch was on that city block next to Swedish Hospital. And it was a 7-story building, but only 4 stories were built out because the money ran out. And that was finished September of 75. And for the opening, there was President Ford, Senator Kennedy, Senator Magnuson, Senator Jackson, and a bunch of other local politicians were present for the opening of the Hutch. And we moved in with, I think the total number of people must have been 150, mostly nurses. That was the biggest number. And then later on, in later years, the upper stories were built out with additional grant applications, and more people were hired and brought on board, and it became an excellent cancer center. So, but then eventually we ran out of space up on First Hill, and the move took place to the current campus, which was bought 15 acres for $30 million, which today is probably $1 billion or more. So that's why we moved. But Swedish Hospital was very generous. I got a large grant in 1979, an additional program project grant, and I needed more beds. And they built us 60 beds, actually, in a new tower. And so we were able to move the patients, the 20 beds, out of the Hutch and have more lab space. But that was all done by handshake. It was not done by a written contract. Now, Swedish benefited because we needed their surgical suites, their radiology services, their the chemistry labs, their consultants, and so on. So that's
So since its inception, you have been the head of the transplantation biology in the Hutch. And I guess in this role, you have already described that you had a lot of postdocs coming to you and learning from you how to do these bone marrow transplantations. But throughout what we've discussed, we've heard a lot about Don Thomas. So I wanted to ask, what kind of a mentor has he been to you, and what made him a good mentor?
Well, he was a good sounding board, basically. He did not work in the laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Bob and I worked for 4 years in the lab, and Don never, except for that one attempt at the horse there, he didn't work in the lab. So Bob and I did all the lab work. But Don gave us free hand. He just, he gave us basically permission to do whatever we thought would be necessary to do in the laboratory. And then we met with him in his office, oftentimes daily. He had a chalkboard on the wall. You see the chalkboard there over on my wall, the green one? That's from 1965, still in Don's office. That chalkboard has seen a lot of experiments explained to him at that time. And he was a very, very good critic. He did all of the administrative junk, all of it. And as we grew larger and larger, I didn't have to worry about hiring nurses. I didn't have to worry about personnel issues. I only had to worry about my own laboratory. And but all the clinical organization that was done, and his right hand on the clinical side, Dean Buckner. And I looked at probably 15 or more, almost 20 job offers, like in the United States, at Harvard, at the University of Pennsylvania, Hopkins, on the West Coast, Stanford, UCLA. Even in Germany, I looked at München and Ulm, and in Holland at Leiden. And I always came back, I always mentioned to Don that I had another job offer, and I was curious. I always came back, they assured you have at least 50% time for research. And I came back to Don and I said, that's a generous estimate, it's probably more. And so in 74, we were at a meeting in Atlantic City, Don and I, and had dinner, over seafood dinner, 3 hours. It just my future. And I said, Don, I looked at all these offers, and they're so totally unattractive because they say it's 50% administration, but it's probably more. And he said, you're probably right. And so in the end, he said, well, if you stay in Seattle, I keep your bag free of administration. And all you need to do is get your research grants funded, because at this place here, you need to get funding for your salary from research grants. The center gives you only very little. And I said, in the end, that's probably what I will do. Now, I realized that I was always going to be in the shadow of Don, and he would get a lot of credit for the work I did, but I felt that was worth it. And so when he got the Nobel Prize, I was actually visiting my mother in Essen. I had just gotten the prize from the the German Cancer Center there in Heidelberg, and swung by my mother's home when I got a phone call from Seattle, from a Seattle Times reporter, and he asked me, it was in the evening hour, he said, "What do you think of it?" I said, "What do you think of what?" And he said, "Dr. Thomas is Nobel Prize." I said, "Oh, great. What else can I?" So I was upset for that evening, but I slept well. The next morning I said, "You can't really be upset about this for the rest of your life, that you didn't get it. You should be happy about it." And that's what my attitude was. And so, the price is just the price. And I took it really, really well. I came home and went directly to Don's office and said, "Hey, way to go. This is great." And so by that time he was retired already. But he still had an office at the Hutch. So I
don't
it, and I didn't mind it.
Yeah.
Because to this date, I hate administration.
No, you don't really have to hide. You have written a number of landmark papers afterwards still. You have, as I already said, standardized allogenic stem cell transplantation. You've conducted a lot of successful research on the major histocompatibility complex and the graft versus host reaction. You have improved conditioning of the transplant, improved immunosuppression. So I have a long list of things that you have achieved as part of this incredible path that you've went. There's only one thing that I still want to ask you, because I hope it's okay that I say you're 89 years old. You are still a professor.
In a few months. I'm still 88.
Oh, you're still 88.
June,
sorry. Okay. So there we go. So you're still 88. So you're still being a professor at UW. You are still the lead of the transplantation biology program. You are still, I assume, a physician treating patients. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. But I'll be retiring in a year and a half when I'm 90, because my last large NIH research grant, the program project grant, will end on June 30th, 2025. I'll hand it over to one of my mentees, who is also a full professor, Brenda Senmeyer. And because of my wife's illness, I handed another grant over to another mentee, Hans-Peter Kiem. In 75, and I'm sorry, in 2025, I'll retire. In July 1 is my first day off. And I'm not sure what I will be doing once retired, but I'll figure it out.
I think are you still rowing? I've read that you are a passionate rower.
Yes, I do still row. My son and I, we row in a double, and then we have a 4-man boat, which we row with friends. But the open water rowing, we do races up to 184 kilometers. You see the map in the back of my room here, the blue thing? That's and there's a race that goes from Tacoma to Port Townsend, which is 112 kilometers on the Sound. We have done that one. And so, we still do races, usually in the 4-man boat, because it's a lot of fun.
But you're not yet retired. So what drives your daily work as of now? So what drives you?
Well, we have still some pioneering work in progress where we try to increase the leukemia cell kill before transplantation using targeted radioimmunotherapy. We're currently using an antibody to CD45, which is a pan-hematopoietic antigen. And together with physicists at the University of Washington, they generate for us a short-lived radioactive isotope. It's an alpha emitter called astatine 211. It has a half-life of a little over 7 hours, is highly energetic, but has a path length of only 60 micron, so very few off-target effects. So this trial, and so a patient who would be entered, say next week, Wednesday, then the physicists go in at midnight and generate the isotope, hand it over to the laboratory of a colleague, the Wilbur lab, over at the U. They couple it to the antibody using a boron cage, and then it's being sent up to the ward immediately with a short half-life and infused into the patient. The idea is to, and it's a dose escalation study using HLA matched, related and unrelated recipients, but also using HLA haploidentical recipients for patients with non-malignant diseases and malignant diseases. And so the idea is to get rid of as much as possible of the systemic chemo radiation therapy using this targeted approach. In the laboratory, I'm working on yet a more refined approach using an antibody to CD117 or c-KIT, which is expressed on stem cells, both normal and leukemic. And so that's what we're currently doing, translating basically, this is animal work that was translated in the clinic. And so that's one thing that I'm still doing. Another thing is, and I mentioned to you that we contacted former patients. We re-recruited an old nurse who, after 45 years with us, retired. And she contacted patients transplanted more than 30 years ago and their donors and obtained blood samples. And so the question that we are asking is, you know, a patient starts out with maybe 0.8% of the donor's stem cells 50 plus years ago, and has to rebuild the whole bone marrow, the immune system, the daily production of close to 1 trillion new blood cells. And how does that compare to the donor who retained more than 99% of the stem cells? How does it compare in regards to mutations, epigenetic changes, telomere length, clonal evolution, and so on? So that's a study that is going on, and we work with a small biotech company founded by a former Hutch fellow, Jesse Salk, and the company is called TwinStrand, and they developed a revolutionary new next generation sequencing system that's far more sensitive, a couple of orders of magnitude more than the commercially used Archer sequencing. And so that's a study that's currently going on, actually. And we have involved also a mathematician, statistician here from the Public Health Service, from the Public Health Division, and are curious as to what's going to come out, actually. It's absolutely fascinating, actually. And we have also in this study included more recent patients where the donor is really old, in their 70s or in their 80s, or the donor is really young in haploidentical transplant, the child to parent, to see how all of this falls out. So that's what's still going on clinically and laboratory-wise.
So how far are we to eliminating cancer?
Good question. I think it has to become really disease-specific. You know, the hope was for leukemias that one could repeat what has been done for chronic myeloid leukemia, you know, with the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, which, however, unfortunately have to be taken lifelong, right? In the majority of cases. But it hasn't panned out for any of the other diseases, unfortunately. And so it's still immunotherapy. I mean, we described in the late 70s and early, we had a couple of New England Journal papers where we described the graft versus leukemia effect. And on the basis of those papers, I introduced in the late 90s the mini transplants, which are minimal conditioning regimen intensity. Patients actually can do this in the ambulatory care setting. We do most of our transplants in the outpatient. So if you are from the greater Seattle area, within half hour plus driving distance, you can live at home. But it depends, the success depends on graft versus leukemia effect. And my colleagues here were very skeptical about this because they said, this is never going to work. And so we were lucky. Our very first patient had a 7-year history of chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and he had been seen at MD Anderson, at Hopkins, and here, and was at the end of the row. He had 80,000 malignant B cells circulating in for microliter. He had the marrow was completely infiltrated. He had lymph nodes, and within 6 months after transplantation, his donor cells, the sister actually, had wiped out these tumors, and he got into a remission that was also molecular. So we had a very sensitive test looking for the IgH where he ran it, and all of a sudden my colleague said, well, maybe there's something to it. And so we tried to enhance also this technique, which doesn't work in every case for reasons that we don't really fully understand. And that's something that probably in the future will have to be worked out. I personally imagine using something like the RNA technology that was used for the COVID immunizations to immunize against the hematopoietic antigens. There are hematopoietic antigens that are specific for the hematopoietic cells and nowhere else. And if I could determine beforehand what the donors and what the recipients, the types are, you could imagine using RNA vaccines to enhance the effect, the graft versus host effect, only against the hematopoietic cells. That's what I can see. And then utilizing this minimal intensity conditioning regimen, which patients don't even lose their hair. I mean, it's very easy going. So
despite all the achievements, there is still a lot of achievements waiting to be unlocked. My final question is, are you a bone marrow donor yourself?
No, we used to, all of us used to be HLA type before the registries even came up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we all waited for, the time where we were needed. And our very first transplant for leukemia was done in, I think, 78. And it turned out that one of the laboratory technicians was a match, and she donated. Mm-hmm. And then as things went on, I became too old for the registry.
Okay.
And so I was never called upon. And the registry didn't exist yet. It was established in the United States with the help of two fathers of two of our patients. One was the patient I just mentioned. She was from Colorado. And the other father was the head of the U.S. Navy, Admiral Zumwalt, and his son was here for transplantation. And they had political influence. And then together with Don Towers and my late colleague, John Hanson, they were able to persuade the government to donate $1 million for establishing the National Bone Marrow Donor Registry. By that time, I was too old, even though I believe that age shouldn't be a limitation for donors. That's my personal belief based on our own observations. We have donors up to the late 80s, and we published a paper actually showing that the recovery of these recipients equaled entirely that of recipients of younger donors. There was no difference in neutrophil or platelet recovery speed, graft versus host disease, acute or chronic, relapse rates, non-relapse mortality, survival. But there's still this mystic belief around the world that older donors aren't good. I don't believe in that.
So
There we are.
we do have a lot of young listeners, so all of you consider becoming a donor. It's very easy. Just go to your webpage, DKMS, or not sure how it's called in the US. I looked it up. So it's called NMDP, National Marrow Donor Program. Be the match. So go ahead and go to the website, click to become a donor. It's very easy. It just takes 20 seconds once you got the swab in the mail. Not even the swab that goes in the nose, like the COVID tests, but really just the one which goes in the mouth. Very easy. So consider becoming a donor. Thanks everyone for listening. Thank you so much, Rainer, for joining us today, for sharing so much about your incredible history and your incredible contributions to advancing the knowledge of mankind and helping over 1 million patients of leukemia and similar diseases to benefit from bone marrow transplants. Thank you so much for all of your work and for sharing it with us. Yeah, I wish you all the best with rowing in 1.5 years, and of course also in the meantime with your job.
Okay, you're welcome, and all the best, and greet Essen.